Creating these classes requires equipment and services that cost money. If you appreciate this education, please think about going to elithecomputerguy.com and offering a one-time or monthly recurring donation. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy, and in today's class, we're going to be doing a brief introduction to SDKs, or software development kits. So in a previous class, we talked about frameworks for programming languages. Basically, what frameworks are is they are packages of code that has already been written in any number of different programming languages to make it easier and faster for you to be able to finish projects. So basically, again, if you're sitting down, whether you're going to be trying to create a video game or you're going to be trying to create a social networking site, the reality is probably 90% of the code that you're going to need to write in order to deploy your project has been written by somebody else before. And so coders, basically what they do is they pre-package all the code that they have already written, functions, libraries, that type of thing. They put it into what are called frameworks, and then you are able to add a framework to your project to make life easier, basically to make it easier, faster, quicker in order to deploy your projects. Well, that is for the standard coding world. So if you're going to be writing code for servers, when you're going to be writing code for web applications, when you're going to be writing code for basic desktop applications, basically you'll be using frameworks. But what about for computerized objects and gadgets? Things like smartphones, things like virtual reality goggles, things like Roku devices. What about these electronic computerized devices that we'll be dealing with? Well, with those, what you're going to be needing to use is something called a SDK, or a software development kit. And what a software development kit is, much like the frameworks, it is pre-packaged material to make it easier for you to be able to write code and basically be able to deploy your projects. So if you get an SDK for something like the Roku player, an SDK for maybe Oculus, some kind of VR system, things that will be offered to you are things such as templates. So again, if you're going to be creating an app, all apps look more or less the same, really, at the end of the day. So things that will be offered to you is basic template. So this is a template. This is what the screen size is. This is what the resolution is. These are all the things that you have to keep in mind. So when you're designing your pages, when you're designing your animations, you have a template to work off of and know what your boundaries, know what your borders, know basically what placements should be, and that type of thing. Also, what will be involved with SDKs is, again, libraries, basically functions, code that can be reused. So if you have to exit out of an application, right? If you're in virtual reality and you have to exit out of your VR application that you're in, basically every VR application is going to exit more or less the same way. There's going to be the same code. So basically you exit out of whatever screen that you're looking at, and that goes to a main menu, right? That's code that actually has to be written out. That has to be put into the computer program so that the computer knows how to exit out of an application. Well, if all applications are basically going to exit the same way, that kind of code can be added to something like a software development kit, so that basically you have that prepackaged way. This is how you enter into a program. This is how you exit out of a program. This is how a program more or less should work. So those are some of the things that are involved with a software development kit. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about it today and why they're so important. So one of the things to realize about SDKs is that these have become much more important over about the last decade or so. So if you go back 15 or 20 years, when people were writing code for computers, the fact of the matter is that they really didn't need many of these software development kits. When you're dealing with the Windows world, when you're dealing with the DOS world, there were programming languages that you could use in order to write for these different operating systems, and basically people just sat down and they were able to code. Well, with the rise of basically these computerized type devices, the mobile world, so iPhones and Android phones, tablet computers, virtual reality, the whole nine yards, basically with the rise of these different computerized gadgets, there became a need for more full-fledged kits that could be presented to developers to make it easier for them to write code for these different devices. Again, basically, if if everybody has a keyboard, if everybody has a mouse, if everybody has a monitor, if everybody's going to be printing out to a printer, you don't need a whole bunch of prepackaged code, templates, that type of thing for coders to be able to do whatever it is they need to do. But here's the thing, when you're trying to write an app, and that app is going to need to run on iOS, plus you want to port that app to have it be able to run on different Android devices, right? Then as you're needing to code and create your application, it becomes much more difficult to understand all of these different environments. And so having some training wheels in order to develop for these environments can be very useful. Again, templates, understanding how the different buttons work, having a library so when somebody touches one thing, you can very easily trigger actions to happen. This becomes far more important. So again, in the coding world now, if you're going to be sitting there and you're going to be developing an application, it's no longer a desktop computer application or a server application. It could be an iOS application, an Android application. Again, if you're doing an Android app, there's 5,000 different Android phones out there. You may be doing Roku devices. You may be doing virtual reality headsets, that type of thing. And so in this type of coding environment, it's very important that basically when a coder decides, oh, I want to go code for the new Oculus device, they can get a software development kit. Basically, from that, they have the basic material that is required to be able to actually create applications for whatever device that they're going to be creating applications for. So that's why there has been a rise in the need for software development kits, and why this has become much more important over the past decade. So this is something you're going to have to be thinking about. Again, when people talk about, what's the best programming language or the best framework or the best this or the best that, again, this is, you're starting to understand why it's so important that you need to have a problem that you're trying to solve for, right? So if you're trying to work for a company that's trying to create content, it's going to be an entertainment company, then understanding how to code for the Roku may be very valuable for you, right? On the other hand, if you're trying to do something such as, again, something like virtual reality, you want to do virtual reality education, then you look at the Oculus or the HTC Rift or things like that. And so I really want you to understand this is why it's so important to have an idea of what it is, what kind of problems you want to solve for, because when you understand that, then you start to get pointed in the direction of, okay, this is the language that I need to know. These are probably some of the frameworks I need to understand. These are the SDKs I need to use, so on and so forth. So now that you have a bit of an idea of what SDKs are, software development kits, let's go over to the computer for a second so I can show you some of the information about SDKs for a few of these different gadgets that are out there. So the first page that I brought up is actually for Roku. So Roku are those little gadgets that you plug into televisions and allows you to watch different quote-unquote television shows on your TV. You'll notice they have an SDK here, documentation. So you're able to create Roku channels with the developer SDK. You can come down here. There's some reference documentation to allow you to understand how to code for the Roku. They have concepts. They have APIs. They have samples. They have additional sample channels down here so you can see what the examples look like. If we just click on one of the links, we can go over, and so scene graph core concepts. The scene graph framework is used for developing channels. This framework incorporates two key concepts: scene graph rendering of the channel screens, XML configuration of the screen graph screens. And so it's important to understand, like if you're going to be developing for Roku devices, these are the things that you're going to have to understand for Roku. If we go over, I pulled up the Oculus page. So Oculus has a developers page. If you go over, you click on something like the Oculus Go, you can come here and you can see that they have information for you, again, with the SDK. Oculus Go is a standalone, all-in-one 3D OF VR headset that runs applications built with the Oculus Mobile SDK or Unity or Unreal integrations. You can come down here. They have native platform, Unreal integration, so on and so forth. You can click down here for the SDK, and I pulled that up, and basically this gives you some information about the SDK and what it gives you. SDK contents, VR API for third-party engine integration, native application framework for building high-performance VR applications, additional libraries providing support for GUI, locale, and other functionality, native project sample application. So again, this is one of the most important things. Again, like all the noobs never want to copy paste. Noobs are always like, I write all my code. It's like, why? Why do you write all your code? That seems like a waste of time, right? So again, think about it for a second, right? A lot of times the application that you're going to create is 95% identical to what 1,000 people have already written, right? And so one of the things is if you go with these SDKs and they have sample applications, they have sample projects for you, one of the very valuable things is you can just go in there and you can rip out massive chunks of code that do what you need have done, and then you add your little modifications. Again, if you can copy paste 1,000 lines of code, that will make your whole project be able to get completed a hell of a lot faster. Again, the important thing to understand when you're going to be copy and pasting code is you do have to be able to audit that code. You do need to be able to read through the code and understand exactly what the code is doing so that you don't add vulnerabilities to the system that you don't mean to add. But again, it's a lot quicker to read code than it is to write code. And so one of the very valuable things with these SDKs is they have sample applications. And I'm going to tell you, 90% of the time, those sample applications look a whole bunch like what your client or what your boss is asking you to do. You go in there, you change some colors, you change some formatting, you change a couple of things. Again, obviously connect to your database, to connect to your backend, and again, you can actually get something up and running relatively quickly with those samples. And then they have tools and resources to assist with native development. So these are some of the things to be looking at, again, with Oculus. If we go over to such as the iPhone, now one of the things that's going to be a little bit confusing when you start talking about SDKs in the real world with all these little gadgets is, again, SDK is a specific thing. So you have the programming language, you have the framework, you have SDKs. These are all individual things, but in the real world, many times all of it kind of gets balled together, right? So when you're dealing with iOS, Swift is the programming language. They have an SDK, they have a software development kit. They also have something called Xcode, which is the environment, basically the IDE that you're going to be using when you're writing the code. And so all of these things actually end up kind of getting balled together. So that's just an important thing to realize. So iOS, again, Apple's developer page. So they talk about the things with a phone here. Again, if we come down, optimize your UI. If you're already updated your app for iPhone X, simply build your app with iOS 12 SDK and test in Simulator. And again, this can be one of the valuable things that's included with the software development kits or the overall environments that are provided to you for creating for these gadgets is things like simulators. So again, if I'm writing an iOS app for an iPhone, I don't necessarily want to have to upload this thing to my iPhone every time I want to do a test. So one of the cool things is I can simply load my code into a simulator on my Mac, be able to test it out, basically use mouse and keyboard in order to test it out, verify that it more or less does what I think it's supposed to do. Then I can put it onto my iPhone to do my final testing. So things like simulators can be very useful. Run in a simulator, do all this different stuff, and basically this gives you some more information about the iOS and basically like the SDK and such. But again, when you're going to be dealing with iOS, you're going to be dealing with Swift as the programming language. Xcode is the actual development environment. And then they're going to have the SDKs for whatever iOS version you're dealing with. Past that, again, you can go over to Android. So Android has a studio. So the Android studio has the Android SDKs built into that. And you can see here, like with their whole studio, you get visual layout editor, so you can actually lay things out here. This is more like an IDE, an integrated development environment. APK analyzer, fast emulator. So again, they've got an emulator here, so you can test things out. Code editor, flexible build system, real-time profiles. So there's a whole bunch of different things here. And again, the important thing to understand is a software development kit is a specific thing. An IDE, so this is like an integrated development environment, is a specific thing. Emulators are specific things, but many times when you're going to be developing, it all kinds of gets lumped into one deal. So if you're dealing with Roku is just, from what I can tell, is basically just an SDK, right? So you're going to be coding things. Here's a software development kit. These are some things to help you out coding for Roku. Again, with Oculus, what you can see with their software development center is you can develop for native, you can develop in Unreal, you can develop in Unity, and so they give you SDKs to make that kind of thing easier. You get to decide how you're actually going to develop. On the other hand, again, you get into the iOS world, or possibly you get into the Android world, and everything is much more lumped together. The IDE, the SDK, the emulator, all of these things kind of come as one single package. So this kind of gives you an idea of SDKs for these different types of gadgets. And basically, what you have to think about with SDKs is if you're going to be creating software or applications, again, for any like non-desktop, non-laptop in general systems, basically there's probably going to be an SDK involved. So that was just a brief overview of SDKs, again, software development kits. Basically what this is these are digital assets that are given to you by these vendors to make it easier for you to code for their environment. Again, if you're going to be a coder, you're going to be coding for all these different types of gadgets. It makes your life a hell of a lot easier if you have templates and you have simulators and you have all of this stuff at your fingertips so that you can get up to speed as quickly as possible. Now, what I showed you today with these SDKs are basically publicly and what appear to be freely available SDKs. One of the things that I will warn you, and this is one of the issues you get into with the SDK world, is they don't have to be freely available. So this is an important thing to be thinking about, again, when you're thinking about what language you use, what gadgets you're going to be coding for, so on and so forth, is sometimes, this used to be more prevalent in the past, but it still does exist, sometimes you actually have to be accepted and you have to go through basically some type of program in order to actually get an SDK from some vendors. So some vendors out there, either for security reasons, or greed reasons, or whatever reasons, they don't want to make their SDKs freely and publicly available, and so they will only offer SDKs to people that are in their like developer program. So they may have a partner developer program, basically people that are in that program or companies that are in that program gain access to the SDKs, and nobody else does. So this can be a real problem for you. So if you see some really cool new gadget out there, that's the greatest thing in the world, and you want to start coding and creating apps for it, if the developer or if the vendor does not give you access to the SDK, then it may just be a moot point. You just don't have the ability to create apps for that particular device. So you do have to be careful about that when you're thinking about creating apps for these different gadgets, is to look and think about what the gatekeepers are for these things, and really think about, is that the type of thing that you want to deal with? One of the big issues going on right now in the iOS world isn't necessarily with the SDK, but in order to load apps onto an iPhone in general, basically the app has to be available on the iOS App Store. And Apple's really weird with their rules. They're really weird with their rules, right? Sometimes things that you would think would get kicked off the App Store are there for years. Other times, apps that seem like they're innocuous get ripped off the App Store, and basically Apple gives very little explanation as to why. And so something that you have to be thinking about is, if you want to create mobile apps, again, do you want to have to deal with a gatekeeper of somebody saying whether or not your app can literally be loaded onto the devices? You can go through all the time, you can go through all the effort to create an application, but again, in the iOS world, if you're not able to get on that Apple Store, the App Store, then that 2 years of work and however much money you've invested basically goes down the toilet. So this is something you have to think about beforehand. Again, so you got to be thinking about like that type of thing with gatekeepers in any kind of project that you're going to be doing. Is there a gatekeeper to the SDKs? Do you have to buy the SDKs? You may just simply have to buy the SDK. The SDK costs $100. The SDK costs $10,000. Do you want to spend that money? Basically, do you have to get accepted in the program? Sometimes you have to go through classes or you have to be accepted into some kind of partnership program. Do you want to go through that? Again, getting onto the App Store, getting onto whatever way your app is actually delivered to the devices. That may be a gatekeeper. That's something that you have to be thinking about. So these are some of the issues that you have to be thinking about in the real world when you're going to be developing code. Again, you can sit there and you're like, I don't want to create web app. Web apps are so old school. I'm going to create apps for X, Y, or Z. And one of the things that you might find out is creating apps for these different platforms may be more difficult, have more hurdles than you're expecting. And frankly, just creating a web app will allow you to do everything that you want to do. And there's no hurdles there. You just spin up your Apache or your Nginx server, you throw in your interpreter, whatever else, and you can have your app globally accessible without any real gatekeepers. So these are some of the things that you have to be thinking about. So basically with software development kits, they make your life a lot easier. Most of the time you will need the software development kits in order to write code, be able to create projects for these different gadgets. So depending on what gadget you're looking at building apps for, basically just do a Google search, again, like with Roku SDK, Google Glass SDK, Apple TV SDK, Samsung Smart TV SDK. That's literally like all you do. It's very simple. Again, it's paint by numbers. If you're looking at the Samsung Smart TV and you're like, wow, I love Samsung Smart TVs. I want to create apps for Samsung Smart TVs. Go and type in Samsung Smart TV SDK. Follow the links, figure out what the requirements are, figure out what the prices are, figure out everything. And if it's good, then start developing for Samsung Smart TVs. If you don't like it, go on to the next thing. So that's a brief interview of SDKs, again, software development kits. Very valuable, generally necessary if you're going to be dealing with gadgets. So something you should definitely look at and do some research. Again, the only thing with this, the only whatever, is do remember nowadays, again, when you're dealing with iOS, you're dealing with Android, you're dealing with some of these other things, a lot of things get packaged together. And so the software development kit will come along with your IDE, your integrated development environment, may come along with the programming language, may come along with different things, and so it's all kind of balled together. So that's just one of those things to just keep in mind. So with that, as always, I enjoyed doing this class. I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Apparently, the type of content you just saw is not what Susan W. wants for the future of YouTube. This means that recommendations by YouTube to this channel have dropped massively and views are becoming comically small. I hate to ask. I used to say I would never ask, but if you could subscribe, like, comment, and most importantly, share the videos that you appreciate, that may help slow the death of this channel. Do remember that if anything at all happens to this channel, you can go to elithecomputerguy.com to view the content and access information not available on YouTube.